Good afternoon, and welcome to Nickel at Noon Online. My name is Michelle Hardy, and I'm a curator with Nickel Galleries and your host today. It is my great pleasure to welcome Raeann Cheung, who is our speaker this afternoon. Born in Hong Kong and raised in Canada, Raeann Kit Yi Cheung is a photographer who leans on a dual heritage to create work that is both personal and universal. No matter how long I've lived here, I continue to feel like a foreigner, she said. Having immigrated almost 5 decades ago, Raeann has come to accept that she's neither Chinese nor Canadian, but rather a Chinese Canadian who embodies an ambiguity and a richness that neither ethnicity can possess alone. It's this duality that informs Raeann's work, a form that accentuates a common yet subdued theme among many Chinese Canadians. Preferring to work through long, slow processes, Raeann finds refuge in her methods that act as an anchor on which she contemplates melded identities to resolve inner complexities. Raeann Cheung began practicing photography in 1983, but considers herself a lifelong learner in the medium. She holds an MA in contemporary photography from Falmouth University in the UK and is a board member of the New Gallery right here in Calgary. Raeann has been selected by Alberta's Exposure Photography Festival as one of the emerging photographers to be showcased in 2020, and her work will be exhibited at the Galt Museum in Lethbridge later this year. We Are Immigrants explores the journey of an artist who began this project as a personal endeavor to learn about the Chinese immigrants who came to Canada a century before, and has required carefully balancing authenticity, storytelling, and public reception through her creative practice. Raeann, it's a pleasure to welcome you to Nickel at Noon.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Michelle. That was wonderful. Hello, everyone. Thank you for taking the time to join me on this call. When I came to this project, or when I began this project, I did not intend for it to be a political one. In fact, I was creating images that were more factual and educational. It might have been because it felt safer or it was easier. I'm not sure. Before my MA, I was quite reserved with expressing feelings in my photographs. But over time, things change, and I think there was a turning point when I became more willing to look within myself and discovered a lingering pain that I didn't know existed, one that still affects me today. And in acknowledging that pain, I have inadvertently turned this project into a personal statement. But being so honest with my feelings in my work has also presented some unforeseeable steps in my path. You know, when I first started my MA, I was naive to think that to be a successful artist is to be able to discover and to express oneself through art. I didn't consider how my work might affect others. I now realize that it isn't simply about discovery or expression. For me, anyway, it's about putting something thought provoking out there with the hope of encouraging a transformation in response to my work. But I've also come to realize that that message in my work can be perceived as something powerful, and that can be beneficial or harmful. Because of that, I'm also needing to regularly check in with my ethical compass and to ensure that what I put out there doesn't do more harm, but instead balances authenticity, storytelling, and public reception. I'm just learning how to strike that balance. So for the next 30 minutes or so, I'd like to share with you this inadvertent process that turned this project into one that was fact-based to one that is political, personal, and emotional, by recognizing that by recognizing and letting go of cultural constraints, personal restraints, and becoming vulnerable so that I can tell real stories ethically and with feelings. By no means is this a unique story, and I hope it would invite other artists and viewers to offer feedback from their own perspective. My project began soon after my mother passed away, and I had just started my MA. I was feeling really down thinking about her one day, and I guess maybe as a way to soothe myself, I began flipping through a lot of family photos. My mother really liked having her photos taken when she was younger, and it is the reason I chose to use the film as my primary medium for my project. Looking back at the photos from the mid 1970s, when I left Hong Kong to join my family here in Canada, I can recall some very challenging times as I was trying to adapt to a new environment. School was particularly difficult with, almost daily public humiliations and bullying. Walking home from school almost meant, or often meant, being taunted by neighborhood kids and being targeted by them with pebbles and acorn nuts, and it was awful. So for so long, I suppressed these memories. I just remember it was so difficult and totally consuming to learn to fit in at school that when I finally did, I just wanted to forget all those bad experiences. I decided, they no longer bothered me. I didn't realize until the day I was flipping through all those family photos, some 50 years later, that those horrible incidents were still bothering me. Of course, by this time I was a lot older, and remembering the details were not as scary anymore. It was amazing how my brain was recalling minute details, like, sounds of the attacker's feet shuffling on cement driveways as they flung pebbles at me, or sounds of their arms whipping by at close range. Even the way they chuckled and celebrated, I still remember all that. I got more and more angry as I was recalling all this, and to a point where there was just tears streaming down my face. And then, very suddenly, just completely out of the blue, my attention shifted. Something, or maybe someone, prompted me to ask the question, if it were so difficult for me as a child to immigrate to Canada in the mid 1970s, then what was it like for the immigrants who came before me? So I began to research. At the outset, I was astonished, to learn how little I knew about the experiences of experiences and the legacy of early Chinese immigrants in Canada. I didn't know that the Chinese were some of the earliest migrants in Canada. I had no idea that it was the Chinese who built the most treacherous part of the railway, the part that went from Port Moody right through the Rockies. I didn't know that the migrants were paid only $1 a day, less than half the wage of some white workers. I didn't know that the Chinese Immigration Act just to discourage the Chinese from entering Canada after the CPR was completed. Much less, there were 3 versions of this act. In 1885, there was a $50 head tax was collected, and then in 1900, $100 were collected, and then in 1903, $500 were collected. I didn't know that a portion of that head tax was collected went directly back to British Columbia, the very province that the Chinese sacrificed so much to keep as part of Canada. I didn't know that the Chinese were so unwanted in Canada that in 1923, the Chinese Immigration Act was renewed to stop all Chinese from entering Canada. Not only was this disruptive to many families, it also separated them for over 2 decades. I didn't know any of that. At first, I kind of doubted myself, and I thought, wow, this is really important stuff. I must have been half asleep when this was being taught in school. But then I began asking around, and I found that, just like me, very few people knew anything about this history of the early Chinese immigrants. And that got me really curious and pumped. Certainly when I was a kid, there was no internet, and it didn't occur to me to go searching for this information. I would have had to have been forced by homework, I think, in order to know anything about it. Nowadays, technology being so advanced and so easily accessible, it's much easier to find information if one really wanted to. But without a reason to, no kid, not even adults, would go looking for this information even if it is available. So all this discovery was happening for me when I had just become a new grandmother. And it dawned on me that, if most people were not aware of this history today, chances are the children of my grandchildren would not know anything about it either if this trend continued. And this is where I think the problem lies. When children are denied of history, they grow up oblivious to it. They cannot be blamed for not knowing or for being unappreciative of their privileges. As I mentioned before, I was so consumed by trying to fit in. When I was a kid, I struggled with wanting to be a Canadian, but I wasn't. I was Chinese, but I didn't want to be. My identity perspective became a little warped as a result. And I grew up having a very poor sense of self. Looking back, I truly believe I would have benefited to know something about this history. I think it would have, if nothing else, given me an anchor on which to place myself, a way to value who I was. Children need mentors to show them what really happened in the past. And for something as important as this, and considering the racial discrimination that perpetuates in our country, I think it must be told, not just to people of Chinese descent, but to all peoples in Canada. It's one way to curb the nasty pattern of anti-Asian racism. So with that in mind, I went on a mission to file and categorize whatever information I could find. And what I discovered was that while there are fictional and non-fictional text references that capture a detailed representation of the history, there are very few archival images that do the same. In the early stages of my research, I was restricted to digital resources because of the pandemic. I reviewed visual archives from libraries and archival institutions across the country, and I only considered archives that clearly stated their sources. In other words, not Google images. My focus was on the contributions of the CPR because that was what brought an influx of Chinese migrants into Canada. I found many images pertaining to construction of the CPR, and there were some images of construction crews as well. Now, as a researcher, I was looking for images from an anthropological and historic standpoints. I also wanted to narrow my focus on evidences pertaining to endurance, physical and emotional suffering, hardships, contributions, basically any visual archives that would reflect the information that I was reading about at the time. But I became a bit discouraged after going through thousands and thousands of images because the number of images that showed stories of Chinese railway workers were few and far between. The album shown here as an example belonged to Andrew Onderdonk, who was the American contractor hired by the CPR to complete the part of the railway that the Chinese worked on. There are 314 images in this album. Only 3 are of Chinese workers, and none of them from close range. So here are the images of Chinese workers from the album. After reviewing so many archives, 2 disparities became apparent to me. One is there are far fewer archival images of early Chinese immigrants versus text references in this context. And there are more archival images of white subjects versus non-white subjects with respect to the CPR construction. And this is misleading, not representative of the history. So my research continues. Now these are images from 2 large albums. On the right is Onderdonk's album, and on the left is from a major J.S. Matthews, who captured a lot of images of the CPR of construction before he became an archivist for the Vancouver City Archives. Many of the images are of the construction, the tunnels that were blasted, the construction crew, even the herds of oxen and horses used on site, but there were no discernible images of Chinese workers whatsoever. Now, I know that there's a difference between my reasons for finding the photographs and their reasons for taking them. The fact that hardly any non-white people were photographed may have a very different meaning to the person who took the photographs and to the viewer. That proves an important point for me. As a consumer of these images, what I see or I don't see is not indicative of what the events were. Just because I don't see any images of hardship and suffering among Chinese immigrants doesn't mean they didn't endure any. Yet, the absence of such images leave a big hole in telling a story for later generations. And that's what's happening today. Sarah Pink is a visual ethnographer and social scientist, and she argues that in interpreting visual images, a researcher should attend not only to the internal meanings of an image, but also how the image was produced and how it was made meaningful by its viewers. To me, the images that both Onerdong and Matthews took were definitely important for preserving memories of the people and of the events that took place, just not of the Chinese. Now, to quote from some supporting material, Pierre Burton was the author of The National Dream and The Last Spike, which the CBC made into movies. In his book, Burton offers insight on the challenges that the Chinese workers faced. And let me read an example here. Deaths appeared to happen oftener among the Chinese laborers than in the white group. A single month in the late summer of Onderdong's first season, called from Henry Canby's diary, gives an idea of their frequency. August 13, 1880. A Chinese drilling on the ledge of the bluff near Alexander Bar is killed when a stone falls from above and knocks him off. August 19, a log rolls over an embankment and crushes a Chinese to death at the foot of the slope. September 4th, a Chinese is killed by a rock slide. September 7th, a boat upsets in the Fraser and the Chinese is drowned. September 11th, a Chinese is smothered to death in an earth cave-in. Yet, in the last week on September 7th, the Island Sentinel proudly announced that there have been no deaths since the 15th of June. Clearly, it did not count Chinese. To this date, I have not seen any images that come close to Burton's depiction. While I appreciate that no one would want to photograph people falling off cliffs or being crushed in caves, I would have expected to see more photographs of the Chinese. So, in essence, what I'm trying to say is that if images could help future generations learn about the past, the images need to depict a reality that is closer to the truth. With what we have available today, that is not possible. Now, I want to align on one term here. According to the Museum of Modern Art, appropriation is the intentional borrowing, copying, and alteration of existing images and objects. A strategy that has been used by artists for millennia, it took on a new significance in the mid-20th century with the rise of consumerism and the proliferation of images through mass media outlets from magazines to television. I have been leveraging this method throughout my project primarily to enhance context using metaphors and symbols. My first attempt at making images involved using pen and ink to appropriate archives that I felt were missing not just context, but content. This was during my fourth semester of my MA, and I wanted to break out of using a camera and do something completely different. And the more I read about this history, the more I responded by adding visual facts to what was missing. And that's basically how the project started out as being factual. To some extent, I think some of these images were quite successful in terms of disseminating information, but considering I was in a contemporary program, the images were not as impactful as I needed them to be. A very wise mentor said to me, "You need to get personal with your project." And the comment really surprised me. I thought, this is already pretty personal. To get more personal would be a bit uncomfortable. But then I really had to think about why I felt that way. As I mentioned earlier, I knew I wasn't very good at expressing emotion in my work, and I realized I needed to understand that further in order to overcome the barriers. I also knew that my culture and upbringing did not facilitate self-expression to the degree that I wanted to have in my art. Now, obviously, everybody has a unique upbringing that influences his or her ability to or desire to show emotions. But with the time constraint that I was in at the time, I just wanted to see at a high level how something as broad as culture may be of influence. So I looked around to see what I could find. Jian Tsai is Associate Professor of Psychology at Stanford University and Director of the Stanford Culture and Emotion Lab. In 2020, she published a paper that touches on several emotional/behavioral patterns in people of European American culture and those of East Asian cultures, and how they express emotions according to their mental states. She has found that European Americans are of individualistic societies. The expression of emotion is a fundamental aspect of positive interactions with others. On the other hand, Tsai suggests that East Asian cultures lean towards an interdependent model of the self, in which being a person means being fundamentally connected to others and being responsive to situational demands. Tsai's research has identified that with European Americans, emotional suppression is associated with higher levels of depression and lower levels of life satisfaction. Whereas for Hong Kong Chinese people, emotional suppression is needed to adjust to others. It is simply a part of normal life and therefore not with depression or life satisfaction. Within their interdependent community, suppressing emotions is how to appropriately interact with others. I do admit that expressing our feelings as children was not something my family was strong on, not until after we grew up and left home. But considering Tsai's study, there is a strong cultural component that seems to contradict my longing to express and the status quo. And this may be my dual identities working against each other. While I want to be more expressive with my art, I was very hesitant because I didn't know what was going to come out, and worse, how my culture might judge me. It's not the same as creating an image with an idea in mind. Rather, I wanted to completely surrender my output to my emotions. Intuitively, I knew that was what I needed in order to break out of old patterns and get in touch with my feelings. So I took my mentor's advice and plunged in. And what came out initially wasn't what I had expected, but was probably quite close to what my state of mind was at the time. So the initial images were quite violent. And on top of that, I was experimenting with many different ways to destroy film and paper, and using that as a way, as a metaphor to represent how the migrants were treated. Now, during this time, I was also guided to look at other photographers making appropriated art. And Brooke Andrews was the first artist I came across. This is his series called Sexy and Dangerous from 1996. He took an original archive of an unknown Aboriginal chief from North Queensland, and he changed his appearance to make him look stronger, more prominent. He cropped the image to zoom into the subject to make him look bigger. He added sepia to enhance the liveliness, the tone of the photo. He widened the white lines so that they extended beyond the body to make his body look like it's endured some torment, but it still stands. And he added Chinese words onto the chest that loosely translates to shifty femininity or mischievous girl. It's quite effective. Now, this is by Carrie Mae Weems, and she has been one of the most influential artists to me to date. This was her series called From Here I Saw What Happened and I Cried, which I absolutely love. It's done on chromatic color prints with sand-blasted text on the glass. And let me read you the description from the Museum of Modern Art. From Here I Saw What Happened and I Cried, Carrie Mae Weems reveals how photography has played a key role throughout history in shaping and supporting racism, stereotyping, and social injustice. This installation is comprised of appropriated photographs of slaves in the American South and other 19th and 20th century photographs of African and African Americans that the artist found in museums and university archives. Among the photographs she selected were daguerreotypes commissioned in 1850 by Swiss naturalist Louis Agassiz, who traveled through the American South with a photographer making portraits of slaves. Agassiz intended to use these portraits as visual evidence to support his theories of the racial inferiority of Africans and to prepare a taxonomy of physical types in the slave population. When we're looking at these images, Weems has said, we're looking at the ways in which Anglo-America, white America, saw itself in relation to the Black subject. I wanted to intervene in that by giving a voice to a subject that historically has had no voice. In addition to looking at similar types of works from other photographers, I also needed a little lift, a little help in terms of letting go of my hesitation of showing emotion in my work. I began looking for artists that are really outrageous in their own right. I wanted to absorb the energy from artists who are not afraid of their uniqueness and personalities. I found many, but this one really stuck with me. Stanislaw Stukowski was a Polish sculptor, quite well established in Poland, but he escaped Poland because of World War II. He eventually ended up in the United States and where nobody knew anything about him. But after years of being in hiatus, a journalist found him, read about his work, and became fascinated by it. Little did he know that Sukowski was not only still alive, but actually was living very close to where he was. So the journalist went to meet him and they became good friends. And eventually, they even started recording lectures of Sukowski. Now, Sukowski's ability to express himself was really outrageous. But for me, it was a breath of fresh air in how he is so confident in insisting that he was the best artist there was in the world. He said, as an artist, you must exaggerate. I felt this statement very liberating, and it has stayed with me ever since. Eventually, I started to create a series of images that, in hindsight, reveal a sense of emotional healing. I wasn't conscious of it at the time, but I was starting to hold the emotions that I wanted to articulate, rather than just slashing emotion across the page. And I noticed I was beginning to talk about what the appropriations meant. By making art, I think it took my focus away from the overwhelm of feeling to how my feelings could transcend through images. Some of them were still fairly graphic, such as these ones, but they did not victimize the subject as in early images. Rather, the subject remained strong despite adversity. I even began adding colors to my images. As artists, some of us have to endure long hours of isolation. I didn't realize it at the time, but I think the long hours in the dark room and talking with my subjects were some of the most healing time for me. Pat B. Allen is a registered art therapist. She wrote the book, Art is a Way of Knowing. There's a chapter in there called Knowing Soul, which she suggests that part of the process is when an image comes to you, you ask what form it wishes to take. For many months, that was all I did. When I got scared, when I began a new image, or when I got stuck with one of them, I just kept asking. Towards the end of my MA, we were given opportunities to have our portfolios reviewed by industry critics. And I was really fortunate to receive feedback from some very well-known individuals. While each of them offered unique advices, all of them suggested that I reach out to the Chinese communities in my area for exposure opportunities. Now, so far, responses of my work from the Chinese organizations have been somewhat muted at this point anyway, but it might be too early to tell, who knows, right? But, nevertheless, one comment from a descendant has been on my mind. With a lot of diplomacy, he said, the images are interesting, but there's a lot to celebrate as well. So I took a step back to understand where he was coming from. And upon some reflection, I felt it would be fair that the images of success and suffering should somewhat reflect the history. Now, from my research, it is certainly easier to find archives of celebration and resilience. But from the text perspective, there are happy stories of early immigrants, but there are far more stories of hardship and suffering, not only of the immigrants, but also of their descendants. And considering that in combination with my own experience as an immigrant, I cannot bring myself to make mostly happy images for the sake of public reception and remain authentic at the same time. But being authentic with such a sensitive topic has been a balancing act for me. On one hand, I'm beginning to find my voice in my photography. On the other hand, I need to consider whom I was impacting. Dan Wong came to Canada in 1922, and most of his children were born here. His son Fred states that his father seldom talked about his early immigration experiences, but Fred has come to understand that there was some form of trauma in his father. As kids, his father would warn him and his siblings about being careful, to avoid trouble, and to not do anything that would draw attention. By consistently hearing that message, Fred feels he subconsciously adopted that same caution as he grew up. Knowing that Fred's father may have suffered some form of trauma keeps me aware of the work that I put out, because what I create could potentially do more harm to his descendants and to other folks with similar experiences. And that's not what I want to do. It's important for me to figure out how to strike a balance between being authentic, telling the stories that I learn, and being aware of those I may impact. Sometimes that balance it's not so easy to find. Now, going back to Carrie Mae Weems, her 1987 series, Ain't Jokin', is a mockery of anti-Black racism. It was exhibited in New York without incident, but when it came to the Dalhousie University, it stirred up quite a different response from the Nova Scotia Black student body. Let's just take a moment to read and to absorb the accompanying text. And I'll just let you read that on your own. As a response to the exhibition, the Black Canadian Student Association of Dalhousie University sent a letter to the University Gallery of their disapproval of the exhibition, citing that it was insensitive, repulsive, and totally counteracts the needs of the Black student population. The students asked for the exhibition to be taken down. They felt the gallery should have taken time to properly consult with the Black community. The students even protested by standing in front of the exhibition, blocking viewers from seeing the images. Now, as a slight comparison, here are some other works of political nature. On the left is Seba Curtis's Talcum from 2015. This is a photographic collage that refers to an incident when illegal refugees from the Middle East were hiding in a truck transporting talcum powder in order to get over the British border. Images of the materials covering the faces of the immigrants who must remain in hiding from state authorities during their illegal stay. On the right-hand side is a series by Gideon Mandel from his series called Living Proof. The purpose of this work was to highlight how social workers in places like India, Ukraine, and Ecuador support AIDS patients, and how the community is raising awareness among transgenders and sex workers about importance of testing and disclosure. As an artist, I feel I have been given a gift to disseminate knowledge and information, but at the same time, I feel I need to hone that gift so that it is channeled with care. When I was invited to participate at this year's Exposure Photography Festival, I was elated, but I also had a knee-jerk reaction. I was excited, of course, for the opportunity, but I was concerned because the showcase would include displaying a selected image in 3 digital billboards across Calgary. My concern was that without context, the general public might misunderstand the meaning. So I consulted with friends and colleagues in the Chinese and non-Chinese communities. And the conclusion I came to was that having the images displayed in public spaces without context might be misinterpreted. My biggest fear was that it would invite ridiculing, taunting, and belittling by individuals who are not aware or who choose not to question the context. Thankfully, Exposure was very graceful, very receptive to my concern, and they changed the selection for the billboards, and I chose to stick with their selection for the gallery. Today, my project continues. And currently, I'm covering stories of families that settle in Alberta. I would like to cover more families in the province, and I would like to expand my research to other provinces, especially in smaller towns. What I really enjoy in getting to know the families firsthand, what I really enjoy is getting to know the families firsthand and deep diving into their history. It's a real honor. So far, the stories I've encountered are that in small towns, the Chinese migrants were very much a part of the community. Many of them supported their neighbors by extending store credits, traded based on goodwill, and contributed as any other member of society. As a Canadian or a Chinese Canadian who now has planted roots in this country, I feel it is not only a privilege to be here, I also feel it is my duty to educate myself about my heritage and to share what I learn with others. It's true that Asians have done well in this country, but that does not make racism any easier to tolerate. I want to contribute in transformative ways for present and future generations that Canada's Confederation came about with not only a lot of sacrifices and hardship, but also with the constant forward-looking vision that the early immigrants had in believing that life could be better if we worked hard and collaborated and dedicated ourselves to creating a better future for our generations to come. So to that end, let me leave you with a very short video.
Why has anti-Asian racism resurfaced? For me, it has never gone away. As a Musqueam elder of Chinese and Musqueam ancestry, I experience this every day of my life. When you take into consideration all of the acts of denial perpetrated by the Canadian government against the Indigenous peoples, many of those acts have been used against the Chinese and the Asian peoples and other peoples around the world. Act now to stop anti-Asian racism.
All right. Thank you very much.